would like to thank again Professor Bruegel and the faculty for this kind invitation, and I'm very happy to be here. And I thank the students and professors for attending this talk. So among the clan kings of the early Roman Empire, Herod, king of Judea, is unmistakably the best known to scholarship, thanks to the detailed historical testimony of Flavius Josephus and the rich and well-preserved archaeological remains of his immense building program. Scholarly debate has been fervently going on over the past decades concerning the dominance of Hellenistic and Roman influences on his rule and architecture in an attempt to decipher the riddle of this enigmatic historic figure. In the first part of my talk today, I will briefly explore the different opinions concerning the nature of Herod's art and architecture and their varied sources of inspiration. Then, I will focus on the site of Herodium, situated 12 kilometers south of Jerusalem, where excavations led by the Hebrew University over the last decades have brought to light remarkable findings that put a new perspective on our perceptions of Herod's buildings program and motivation. Several scholars, such as Dwayne Roller, Yoram Tzafrir, Lee Levine, and Catherine Gleason, emphasize the architectural features in Herod's buildings that show clear Roman influence, and discuss the effect that Herod's visit to Rome in 40 and 18 BCE and the building that he saw there had on his constructions in Judea. They claim that Roman influence on Herod's buildings program went farther than what was enough to satisfy his Roman patrons. In their view, Herod used his construction projects to manifest his close connection with Augustus and Rome, not just in direct ways, such as the establishment of temples to the emperor cult in Caesarea Maritima, Samaria Sebaste, and Paneon, or the naming of cities, buildings, or parts of buildings after the emperor or other members of the imperial family, but also in several indirect ways. For example, in many of his construction techniques that are explicitly Roman are utilized. The most prominent example being the use of opus reticulatum in Jericho, Jerusalem, and Paneon. Use of genuine Roman material is also attested, such as pozzolana for hydraulic concrete used in the construction of the harbor of Caesarea Maritima, or the cinnabar, apparently originating from the imperial mercury mine in Spain, used as red pigment for the wall decorations of his third palace in Jericho. Herod introduced to Judea new forms of buildings that have no antecedents in this region, such as Roman theaters and Roman bathhouses. He also made an extensive use of domes and vaults in his constructions in a scale unprecedented in Judea. The king introduced into local architecture new forms of decoration, which are explicitly Roman, such as opus sectile floors, Pompeian wall decoration, modillion cornices, and stucco ceilings in the coffer style, providing some of the first examples of such Roman traits in the East. Scholars' opinions differ with regard to Herod's motivation for relying so heavily on Roman forms of art and architecture. While Roller maintains that it was just another way of Herod to manifest his political submission to Rome, Levine argues for the king's sincere appreciation of the Roman culture and an acknowledgement of its superiority. In contrast, scholars such as Gideon Ferster, Achim Lichtenberger, and Catherine Larson trace Hellenistic prototypes and antecedents for Herod's buildings and decoration in Alexandria, Antioch, and elsewhere in the Hellenistic realm. Lichtenberger suggests that when Herod chose to use explicitly Roman materials, building methods, and forms of art and architecture, it was not due to the Roman character, but because of the high-quality expense and because they were trendy. His ability to acquire such luxuries is interpreted by him, therefore, as an expression of his royalty. Or in the words of Lichtenberger, Romanization in Herod's kingdom was not a goal of Herodian policy, but the result of Herod's claim to be a Hellenistic king. But as Miguel John Versluis has rightly put in his book on Commagene, with regard to another client king under Augustus, Juba II, presenting oneself as a Hellenistic king while at the same time displaying great loyalty to Augustus and Rome was not perceived as an inconsistency at the time. Namely, Herod could present himself simultaneously as both a Hellenistic king, although he was not quite so, or not fully, at least not an independent Hellenistic king, and as a Roman client king, which he clearly was, and in this respect, he was not different from any other client king of the early empire. Nevertheless, Herod's art and architecture are much more complex and hold much more than a combination of Roman and Hellenistic models and forms that are sometimes appear juxtaposed and sometimes intermingled, as can be seen in this example. At least 4 more aspects of Herod's character and identity have substantially had influence on the choices he made while devising his building program. Without getting into the discussion or the question of how Herod perceived his own Jewishness, we can all agree that Herod was a king ruling over a kingdom with a prominent Jewish population. Therefore, Jewish norms and traditions have influenced many aspects of his construction, such as his enormous investment in the rebuilding of the temple and the enlargement of the temple compound, his avoidance from building pagan, non-Jewish temples within the boundaries of his kingdom, other than the temples to the ruler cult of Augustus, as well as his general avoidance from figural depictions in the decoration of his palaces in accordance with the Second Commandment. The transformation of frigidaria pools in the Roman-type bathhouses he incorporated in his palaces into ritual bath, mikvaot, is particularly telling and present another example of the creative combinations in Herodian architecture. Nevertheless, it was already the Hasmonean kings, Herod's predecessors, which integrated Greek bath complexes into their palaces, as can be seen in their winter palaces in Jericho. They also preceded him in that they had already incorporated ritual bath alongside Greek-style bathing facilities into the private wings of their palaces. Herod was following the Hasmonean king's example in many other ways as well. He continued to use the winter palaces in Jericho, as well as the desert fortress palaces along the eastern border of his kingdom, adding to them and elaborating them. In a similar fashion to his Hasmonean predecessors, he enthusiastically incorporated swimming pools and gardens in all of his palaces and constructed elaborated aqueducts to lead fresh water to fill up the pools and water the gardens at these sites. Therefore, despite rivalry and enmity between Herod and at least some of the fractions of the Hasmonean family, Herod was clearly influenced by the Hasmonean model of royalty and made an effort to present himself as a legitimate successor of the Hasmoneans. Herod perhaps suppressed his Idumean descent, as we learned from Josephus, which cites Nicolaus of Damascus, Herod's court historian, as claiming that Herod's father comes from a respectable family of Jews that returned to Judea from the Babylonian exile. However, his Idumean descent may have also played an important role, as Yitzhak Magen and Achim Lichtenberger have suggested. They have claimed that Herod's Idumean background led him to construct 2 ritual complexes comparable to the Jerusalemite Temple Mount, one on top of the cave of the patriarchs in Hebron, and the other at Elonei Mamre, both at the heart of the former Idumean territory, and perhaps meant for an Idumean audience. Lastly, but perhaps most importantly, it was the late Professor Ehud Netzer, the most prominent scholar of Herodian architecture, that stressed the important part that Herod's own personality and interest in architecture played in shaping the king's construction program. He claimed that although Herod's architectural designs are based on Hasmonean and Hellenistic traditions and present strong Roman influence, they are in their essence original creations that stemmed from the king's comprehensive sense of design and planning, combined with his practical and economic approach. Herod's marks are seen, according to Netzer, in the choice of dramatic locations for his palaces, the combination of several functions in one site or one building, and the shaping of the landscape using artificial mounds and massive rock cuts. These unique characteristics, shared by many of Herod's construction projects, attest in Netzer's view to the fact that Herod took an active part in the planning and designing of his architectural endeavors. This intricate web of considerations, motivations, and sources of inspiration turns Herodian architecture and art to what they are, a complex bricolage so hard to define. One remarkable example of this amalgam of sources of influence is the plan of Herod's complex for mass entertainment excavated by Netzer in Jericho, that combines a theater with a gymnasium and an enormous peristyle palestra meant for horse races. No wonder that Josephus is not sure how to call this complex and gives it three different definitions: a theater, a hippodrome, and an amphitheater. The fact that building types and forms of decorations were not yet standardized gave the architects and artists working under Herod a great variety to choose from and the freedom to make new and original combinations. Now, finally, we can move to the second part of my talk and discuss how the recent discoveries at Herodium shed new light on the nature of Herod's art and architecture. Herodium is especially important for our discussion due to several reasons. Clearly, Herodium was important specifically to Herod. Here, his mother's carriage turned over when he was fleeing the Parthians and their Hasmonean allies on the route from Jerusalem to Nabatea in 40 BCE, and Herod almost committed suicide. Later, he established a fortified palace at the site and named it after himself. This palace also constituted an administrative center and a district capital, as well as the king's burial place. In recent years, ongoing archaeological excavations at the site laid by Netzer, and after his tragic and premature death caused by a fall at the site by Roi Porat, exposed the mausoleum, identified by the excavators as the king's final resting place. Also exposed was a small theater with a beautifully decorated royal box, including pictures and vistas and human figures, unprecedented in Herod's other construction projects that generally conform to the Jewish norm of abstention from depicting human figures. Following these discoveries, the expedition continued exploring the upper part of the slope and the double circuit wall that surrounds the mountain palace fortress. It exposed the royal winery and a 16-meter-high ashlar-built corridor meant to allow entrance into the fortified palace through artificial fields that created the tumulus shape of the hill. But this corridor was never put to use. I will start my discussion with the mausoleum and its architectural decoration, which I had the privilege and opportunity to analyze and publish as part of the excavation report volume that came out in 2015. In 2007, Netzer exposed on the northeastern slope of the upper part of Herodium the remains of a mausoleum. This mausoleum is one of the most impressive funerary monuments ever to be built in Judea. Despite skepticism concerning its identification as the final resting place of the king, raised by Joseph Patrick, Benjamin Arubas, and a few others, the Hebrew University expedition is of the opinion that its size and decoration befit a tomb for a king. Enough has survived to allow a reconstruction of a 3-story monument that attained a height of almost 25 meters. The reconstruction proposal, a result of a meticulous study by Rachel Chachi, the architect of the expedition, presents a 3-storied structure with a concave conical roof. On top of the partially preserved in situ podium that contained the bottom room, a square structure was built, decorated by Doric pilasters bearing a Doric frieze and containing another room. A tholos encircled by 18 Ionic monolithic columns was built above and was roofed by a conical roof surrounded by 6 urns with a supplementary urn on top of a Corinthian capital crowning the entire structure. The tomb at Herodium belongs to a rather large group of freestanding burial structures and commemorative monuments comprising an edicule on top of a podium, dating back to the Hellenistic and Roman periods. These tombs consist of a high podium supporting at least one story. The upper story can be either in the shape of a naiskos, a prostal niche, or a round pavilion, namely a tholos, as is the case at Herodium. Tombs of these types seem to have made their appearance in Judea during the Hasmonean period. The tomb of the royal priestly family, erected by Simon the Maccabee at Modi'in, has not survived, but according to its description in First Maccabees and by Josephus, it was high enough to be seen from afar. Namely, it was probably built on top of a high podium and was decorated with large columns and trophies. In contrast to funerary monuments of the naiskos or prostal niche type, those with the tholos on top of a podium were rather rare in the Hellenistic period. One example, dated to the early 3rd century BC, is documented in Marsala in Sicily. This type of monument became very popular in the late Republican and Augustan periods, and examples are abundant mainly in Italy and Gaul. In Asia Minor, we find similar monuments, for example, at Pergamon and near Ephesus, but only in the 2nd century CE. As we know of no recent antecedent in Judea or in the other eastern provinces, it seems rather clear that the inspiration for the construction of this mausoleum came from Rome. Nevertheless, several Hellenistic traits are discernible, such as the use of Ionic rather than Corinthian columns for the tholos peripteros and the choice of a 2-fascia architrave. When King Herod or his architects chose this type of funerary monument for the mausoleum, they were probably interested in an up-to-date monument that would be both elegant and remarkable. In this case, as in many other cases, Herod expressed his innovativeness and introduced into Judea a type of funerary monument that was in widespread use in Italy, but was until then unknown in Judea. The architects of the mausoleum chose not to imitate, but to adapt the Roman prototype to the local taste. Thus, for example, the style of the carving and the details of the decoration reveal local workmanship, and local taste manifested in the choice of modillon cornices on both stories, as well as in the carving style of the rosettes and acanthus leaves of the crowning Corinthian capital. It seems that the Hasmonean heritage was also taken into consideration. Beside the famous family tomb in Modi'in mentioned above, Josephus mentions funerary monuments erected by the Hasmonean kings in their desert fortress palaces, Alexandrion and Hyrcania. Therefore, the mausoleum presents a synthesis of Roman, Hellenistic, and local traditions and fashions. In 2008, the Herodium expedition discovered a small theater with an elaborately decorated reception area above the Summa Cavea on the slope of the mountain palace fortress, just a few meters from the mausoleum. As opposed to the mausoleum, the theater and its reception area were covered in debris when Herod, late in his life, decided to cover the entire hill with massive fill, constructing the artificial conical mount. The still standing main room of the reception area was lavishly decorated with subtly executed stucco work, highly colored walls, and framed pictures. The later, not yet attested in Herod's kingdom, contained Nilotic landscapes with vegetation, architecture, ships bearing armed men, animals such as goats, dogs, crocodiles, bulls, and even a faun. The discovery of these framed pictures, or pinakes as they were known at the time, opened a new chapter in the research of Herodian art, its connections with the surrounding world, and our understanding of the development of art in the region at large. Different scholars related the framed picture to sacro-idyllic, historiographic, and mythological scenes. Sylvia Rosenberg proposed that the reception area at the theater was decorated towards Marcus Agrippa's visit to Judea in 15 BCE, and that the motifs used allude to Herod's affiliation with Augustus and Agrippa. Depicting battleships and Nilotic motifs was meant to commemorate the victory of Augustus and Marcus Agrippa over Mark Antony and Cleopatra in the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Based on technical and stylistic comparisons of the paintings and stucco work, Rosenberg has even suggested that the paintings were realized by traveling artists from Alexandria, experienced in figurative art and unemployed after Cleopatra's fall. If Rosenberg's claim is true, this is a radical example to the extent that the king was willing to go in order to show his loyalty and admiration to his Roman patrons. He was willing to break from his normal adherence to the prevalent abstention from human depictions in order to please his prominent guest, Marcus Agrippa. Nevertheless, the reception area at the theater raises another question of cultural influence. Similar royal boxes in theaters are not very common, and most of the examples come from Italian villas. One parallel is especially interesting, though its date is uncertain. It comes from Publius Vedius Pollio's villa in Pausolipum, near Naples. Pollio apparently had some connections with Herod, as attested by the 2 private shipments of his imported wine from the island of Chios, found in Herod's palaces at Herodium, Masada, Caesarea, and Samaria. It may be suggested that this is the same Pollio that Josephus mentions as the host of Herod's sons during their stay in Rome. His acquaintance with Pollio perhaps was one of the triggers that encouraged Herod to become a wine manufacturer himself, as is evidenced by the most recent surprising discovery inside the double-circuit wall of the mountain palace fortress at Herodium. West of the entrance room to the upper palace, what seems to be a royal winery was found, including a few dozen enormous important dolia embedded in the floor and meant for the storage and probably fermentation of locally manufactured wine. These recent findings suggest that Herod's reference group, or at least one of his reference groups, was the Summi Viri in Augustus' court, like Publius Vedius Pollio, and not just the other client kings or the contemporary Hellenistic kings that are normally taken into consideration when thinking of the model for Herod's actions and rule. Finally, I would like to turn to the one less important result of the recent excavations at Herodium that perhaps more than anything else reflects Herod's own personal choice and attests to his state of mind during the latest years of his reign that are so vividly described in dark colors by Josephus. While considering the motivation that lay behind Herod's construction projects, Netzer claimed that Herod's buildings were established out of a practical approach for a defined purpose and objected the idea that they manifest the caprices and building lust of the king, as suggested by many others. Nevertheless, the results of the ongoing excavations at Herodium show that when it concerned his final resting place, Herod was inclined to radical changes of mind. He built and then decided to discontinue the use of several elements of his palace, in the construction of which much energy and funding had been invested. Some haven't been put to use at all. Netzer has suggested that the mausoleum was not Herod's first choice for his final resting place. A tomb estate was first created at Lower Herodium, including a processional course and a monumental building serving as a triclinium, perhaps with water installations and a ritual bath. A large group of ashlars with drafted margins and elements of a large Doric frieze that were found in secondary use in a nearby Byzantine church were ascribed by Netzer to this earlier tomb. The wreath that adorns one of the metopes supports Netzer's proposal, as several tombs in the necropolis of Jerusalem and Western Samaria are similarly decorated. The motif that interrupts the normal sequence of rosettes or discs is in all cases a wreath or two wreath flanking grape clusters. More dramatic changes of mind were evidenced during the exposure of the theater, storerooms, and what seems to be a living quarter with bathing facilities near the mausoleum to its west, which were put out of use and covered for the creation of the artificial mountain. Despite its beauty and the funding that was invested in its construction and decoration, the theater was also eventually covered in the final stage of construction, when a decision was made to turn the entire hill into a cone-shaped mountain. In Herod's days, two straight and wide staircases were built on the slope in two different stages. The earlier one coexisted with the theater and the other structures on the slope, while the later staircase was constructed on top of the earlier one in a slightly different orientation, only at the time when the construction of the artificial cone-shaped mountain was created, apparently during the last years of the king. Before the excavation, it was unclear where this later staircase was leading. It was thought that the latest staircase was meant to lead into the impressive corridor with a series of arches spanning its width on 3 levels, buttressing the corridor's thick sidewalls supporting the massive fields of the artificial mountain behind them that also was exposed by the Herodian expedition. Surprisingly, this corridor had barely been used, having been filled soon after or even before its completion, and the staircase eventually continued on top of it at a higher elevation. The excavations of the arch corridor started with stabilization and conservation works on the 2 side walls of the corridor, which were preserved to a maximum height of about 16 meters, thanks to the thick and massive fields that covered them both on the inside and the outside. It became immediately clear that these were intentional fields meant to block the corridor, and its composition is very similar to that of the fields that were used outside, creating the artificial cone-shaped mountain. 5 sets of arches were built along the corridor, each with 2 or 3 arches built one above the other, and 2 wide arches were built at both ends of the corridor. The arches were designed to buttress the corridor walls against the pressure caused by the fields from the outside. The elevation was adjusted to the desired slope of the ramp inside the corridor and to the desired slope of the cone-shaped mountain on top of the walls. The middle level of the arch corridor maintained a continuous sloped line and serves as a passageway level, while the lower set of arches supported a constructive fill upon which the foundation of the passageway's floor was laid and were founded on the bedrock. The passageway had stairs along its course. However, these stairs were later removed and none of them was found in situ. Below the field that blocked the corridor, a built drainage channel was exposed. The channel started off below the threshold of the southern opening of the entrance room leading into the palace at Upper Herodium, then continued to the northern opening of the room, entered the corridor, bypassed the western doorpost of the northern opening of the corridor, and then turned into one of the water cisterns on the slope. Clearly, the drainage channel was built when a decision was made to put the corridor out of use and was meant to drain the courtyard of the mountain palace fortress once the corridor was filled and sealed. Once the drainage channel was built and fields covered the corridor, it was sealed on both ends. At the northern end of the corridor, a sloped terrace wall was built, supporting the fields inside the corridor. The excavation showed that the northern entrance, the arch above it, and the northern end of the corridor walls were damaged and partly collapsed before the terrace walls sealed the entrance. Both the wide arch and the northern wall of the corridor into which the arch was incorporated were leaning sharply towards the north, as a consequence of an earthquake or more probably a local failure in the construction of the wall. North of the arch corridor, two massive retaining walls were found, abutting its northern wall. The two walls, together with a compact fill between them, functioned as the foundation for the continuation of the latest staircase mentioned before. The top of this foundation reached the arch corridor in a much higher elevation than that of the original passageway, making it clear that it was not meant to give access into the corridor, as had been anticipated, but instead climbed on top of it after it was filled and sealed. According to the result of the excavation, when Herod decided to turn the upper part of the slope of the Herodium Hill into an artificial tumulus, the arch corridor was built, intended to allow the continuation of the full functioning of the palace by giving access to the palace through the fields of the artificial mountain. In the next stage, the overall plan of turning the entire mountain into a burial memorial was set into motion. The arch corridor was sealed and blocked, and the latest staircase continued on its top. Eventually, the fields were laid on both sides of the corridor and along the entire perimeter of the hill to turn it into a tumulus or memorial mound. Putting the corridor out of use seems to be part of a new perception of the site that Herod and his architects devised at some point when the corridor's construction was almost complete. Perhaps the partial collapse of the northern part of the corridor served as a trigger, but the consequences of the decision to cover the corridor rather than rebuild the part that had been collapsed were crucial. The palace was turned into a memorial reached only by a ceremonial staircase at a level much higher than the original entranceway. It seemed that this was the point when Herod decided to cover the theater and the other buildings down the slope. The only monument standing and projecting on the slope was the mausoleum. A royal funerary monument was thus created, comprised of an Italian-style mausoleum with a tumulus most reminiscent of the Comagene tumuli or the Macedonian ones, a most striking example of Herodian bricolage. This sequence of changes of mind by Herod and his architects corresponds with his frequent changes of mind depicted by Josephus in relation to his will. Josephus mentions 7 different wills made by Herod, and he detailed at least 4 of them. In each of these wills, a different combination of sons inherited Herod. Clearly, his approaching death was occupying Herod's thoughts, and unlike his usual self, he seems to be contemplating until he finally made up his mind concerning his burial place and his inheritance. The magnificent memorial erected was protected within the boundaries or within the borders of Idumea, his father's homeland, and where he probably had many supporters and felt safer. Yet it could have been viewed clearly from the top of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The volcano-shaped silhouette of the mount, coupled with the garden surrounding the mausoleum that created a prominent green spot on the yellowish desert skyline, made Herod's memorial easy to recognize from afar. Thank you.